Rubicon by Tom Holland, which is a great read about the last days of the Republic and a great help to me during the Julius Caesar episodes. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so that they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 71, Otho and Vitellius. On January 15, 69 AD, Otho assassinated Galba and fulfilled the prophecy that had been driving the young aristocrat for the past few months, that Galba would soon be dead and Otho would succeed him. Of course, Otho had been working under the assumption that the prophecy meant Galba would adopt him and he would ascend to the throne legitimately. But having been passed over for adoption, Otho fulfilled the prophecy by other means. Otho, however, was not the only one who had an eye on the throne, nor the only one who was willing to go to violent, illegitimate lengths to seize it. In the weeks leading up to his death, Galba had been receiving reports that the legions on the Rhine, ostensibly led by Vitellius, were in full revolt. In public, Galba downplayed the danger and brushed aside worries that something was seriously amiss in the north, but when Otho finally claimed his prize and became the supreme ruler of the Roman Empire, he discovered that it was not a unified state he inherited. Not only was the revolt along the Rhine much more serious than anyone thought, it would prove to be the only issue Otho would deal with as emperor. Whatever plans he had, and whatever dreams he dreamed, for the rest of his short life, Otho would be consumed with beating back the insurrection in the north, and ultimately wind up dying in the attempt. Otho had apparently been so focused on asking the prophets when he would be emperor, that he forgot to ask them for how long he would be emperor, because the answer would have been not very long, and maybe then he would have thought twice about the whole project. The funny thing is that the revolt that would eventually take Otho down had nothing to do with Otho himself. It was actually a revolt against Galba. But when word came north that Galba was dead, well, everyone was so revved up already that the treasonous event horizon was now in the rearview mirror. Nothing less than total capitulation on Otho's part would have averted their planned invasion of Italy. Along the Rhine, the rebellious pot started boiling in the wake of Vindex's revolt. As you know, Virginius Rufus, leading the legions on the Upper Rhine, put down the revolt, and then refused his troops' offer to declare him imperator. The Rhine legions went back to their camps and continued their nominal support of Nero at the behest of their obviously popular commander. However, when Galba came to power, things began to get ugly. For one thing, Galba had obviously been on the side of Vindex, even if he had never come to the latter's aid. So when he marched through Gaul on his way from Spain to Italy, Galba went out of his way to praise and reward the local tribes that had risen up along with Vindex. This support came at the expense of the tribes that had fought with the Rhine legions against the insurrection. Galba then compounded this slight by ignoring the Rhine soldiers themselves when it came to doling out honors and rewards. He did not punish any of them, but it was clear that Galba was stiffing them on his way into office. When the local auxiliaries and camp legionnaires got together and compared notes, they discovered that for the high crime of doing their duty, they had all been given the shaft. This, coupled with Galba's lingering reputation in the region from his tour there during Caligula's reign, meant that it was only with great difficulty that the commanders were able to convince the men to accept Galba as their legitimate emperor. But they never did accept Galba in their hearts. Virginius was replaced by someone Galba could trust, a decision that only exacerbated the situation. Fonteius Capito, the commander of the Lower Rhine, was soon implicated in a plot to overthrow Galba and was killed by the two officers who discovered his treachery. The assassination of Capito is what led Galba to appoint the totally harmless and utterly inexperienced Vitellius as a replacement, presumably to prevent this sort of thing from happening again. But the thing about the Capito affair is that there is a great deal of plausible speculation that Capito was not fomenting revolution, that instead he had refused to go along with the plot of the two officers who eventually killed him. Because one of those officers, Fabius Valens, had a great deal to do with convincing the supposedly harmless Vitellius that he could be emperor and to lead the Rhine armies in revolt. The other major influence on Vitellius was Aulus Caecina, who had served in Spain and was an early supporter of Galba. As a reward, he was able to skip a few places up the chain of command and was appointed legate of one of the legions on the Upper Rhine. But the young, charismatic, and well-liked Caecina was also ambitious and greedy. Not long after taking up his new post, he was accused of embezzling funds and had every reason to fear that old stick-in-the-mud Galba would soon strip him of his command, or worse. As eager and opportunist as the world has ever known, Caecina determined that the only way he was escaping his predicament in one piece was to stoke the resentment of the men under his command and hopefully convince them that as the cream of the Roman legions, which everyone agreed they were, that they deserved an emperor who showed them the proper respect. Caecina's motivation then in leading a revolution is clear. He was facing possible execution if Galba remained emperor. Valens' motivation, though, is far less clear, and he seems to simply be an unscrupulous commander nearing the end of an undistinguished career who felt that he had been treated badly by the new emperor and saw a chance to pole vault his way into power and relevancy. Perhaps it was simply a love of intrigue for intrigue's sake. However it happened, when the new year came around, both men were ready to throw off Galba's so recently saddled yoke. On the 1st of January, the provincial legions renewed their solemn oaths to protect and defend the empire for the greater glory of the empire in whose name yada yada yada. This is supposed to be a mere formality, but at the prodding of Caecina, 2 legions on the Upper Rhine refused to re-up their commitment. Despite the efforts of the few officers present who remained loyal to the emperor, the mutinous soldiers toppled statues of Galba brought in for the ceremony. Rather than swearing an oath to the emperor, the men swore allegiance to the Senate and the people of Rome, and declared their intention to overthrow the usurper Galba, for the sake of, liberty and stuff. With this initial spark struck, things happened fast. Situated in what is today Cologne, Vitellius learned of the mutiny, but rather than immediately making preparations to put the clamp down on it, as would have been expected, he instead sent around word to his commanders that either they were going to have to march north and fight their comrades, or join in the mutiny themselves and declare their own emperor to take Galba's place. Valens, who had no doubt spent the last few months whispering in Vitellius' ear, was the first commander to arrive in Cologne with his decision. He hailed Vitellius as imperator. Vitellius accepted the salute, and just like that, the revolt was off to the races. By the 2nd or 3rd of January, all the legions on the Rhine, probably the most formidable fighting force in the empire, except that they never would get their war with Galba. 2 weeks after Vitellius had been declared imperator by his men, word came that Galba had been assassinated and that Otho was the new emperor. But by this point, events along the Rhine had gone way beyond simple revenge. The commanders had the brass ring in their sights, and their men saw no downside in moving forward until the whole empire was theirs to gorge themselves on. Life in a legionary camp along the Rhine River was no picnic, so when they learned that the man who had gotten them all fired up in the first place was dead, well, unless Otho planned to step aside in favor of Vitellius when they all arrived in Rome, the new emperor was in the same place as the old emperor, namely, in their way. Back in Rome, Otho arrived at the palace following his coup and began running through Galba's personal correspondence. Mostly boring stuff, taxes, petitions, favors, and hello, what's this? The Rhine legions are in full revolt, have declared Vitellius emperor, and are readying to march on Rome? Well, I think I know what I'm doing today. Otho first attempted to reason with Vitellius, and the two engaged in an increasingly acrimonious correspondence that had both promising money, influence, and property in exchange for the other abandoning his illegitimate claim to the throne. Neither backed down, and the negotiations, if they could even be described as such, went nowhere. Otho had the support of the Praetorian Guard and the Senate in Rome, and assurances from governors across the Central and Eastern Empire that they backed him. But unfortunately, all of this amounted to very little when it came to countering an invasion from the north. At his immediate disposal, Otho had the Praetorian cohorts, the remains of the legion Galba had decimated, and a collection of parade-ready soldiers used mostly for show. While he corresponded with Vitellius, Otho conscripted around 2,000 gladiators and gathered up an undefined number of cavalry, but nothing he had on hand would be able to stand a chance against what Vitellius was sending south. Otho's only hope lay in the Balkans, and he ordered the legions stationed there to pack up their winter camps and head forthwith to northern Italy. Otho was hoping to join with them and then march through the Alps to face down Vitellius before the latter could reach Italy. But by the middle of February, his intelligence reported that the Vitellian forces were already on the march. While Vitellius stayed behind to oversee the now dangerously under-garrisoned border with Germania, Valens and Caecina each led separate columns south. Valens was to come in from the west and Caecina the east. Quickly, Otho abandoned the idea of marching through the Alps and determined that he would need to make his stand at the Po River. He ordered the forces at his disposal, maybe 10,000 troops, to march north to the Po Valley and delay the advancing battalions long enough for the Balkan reinforcements to arrive. At the same time, Otho sent a maritime force up the western coast of Italy to Gaul. The idea seems to have been for this navy to attack the local coastal communities aligned with Vitellius, hopefully forcing Valens, leading the larger of the two columns, to halt his march and come to their aid. If this was in fact the plan, there is some debate about what exactly this maritime expedition was actually up to. They were moderately successful. They raised enough hell that Valens broke off a detachment from his column to defend the communities, and a brief battle was fought, the first of what was now officially a civil war, near a place known as the Forum Julii. The Othonian forces won the initial encounter, but were driven back after a counterattack. The two sides then hunkered down in a mutual stalemate. This opening encounter of the war was inconclusive, but ultimately irrelevant, as it slowed Valens down little and occurred outside of what would prove to be the main eastern theater of the war. On that front, helped by a mild winter and a smaller force, Caecina was making much faster progress south. Though Caecina and Valens were technically on the same side, the two detested each other and were engaged in a fierce, if unspoken competition to reach Italy first, defeat Otho first, and enter Rome first. The official plan was for them to cross the Alps at the same time and meet up on the other side, but Caecina paid no attention to this and plowed ahead, regardless of where Valens might be at. He emerged into northern Italy in March and went to work securing everything north of the Po River. A detachment of Otho's advance force already occupied the important city of Placentia on the southern banks of the Po, so Caecina took up residence in Cremona on the northern bank. Prudence dictated that Caecina hold Cremona and wait for Valens, but believing that his veterans would make short work of Otho's outnumbered and soft parade units, Caecina decided to immediately take Placentia by force. But in 2 days of intense fighting, Otho's forces successfully repelled the assault, forcing Caecina to abandon the attempt. The rest of the advanced Othonian army had been encamped at Verona, awaiting the imminent arrival of the Balkan legions. Indeed, an advance force of about 2,000 had already arrived. But when they heard of the assault on Placentia, they rushed to relieve their comrades. But before they could arrive, Caecina had already been beaten off, so they set up camp at Bedriacum, about 30 miles east of Cremona on the north side of the river. Humiliated by his defeat at Placentia, and hoping to regain the upper hand before Valens arrived, Caecina schemed up an ambush he hoped would help him do just that. Leading a small detachment of infantry and cavalry down the road between Cremona and Bedriacum, he hid the infantry in the trees alongside the road, and then sent out the cavalry to engage in one of the oldest military tricks in the book. Attack the enemy's camp, pretend to be driven off,